guy just laughed at me from the balcony. Dork.
From shutting down a guy in the balcony to calling out an ESPYS audience member on live television, this is when drunk hecklers get destroyed by Shane Gillis.
And I was just like, dude, what the fuck? I saw you walk on stage wearing those, and I was like, there's no way this guy's funny.
Not with rehearsed roasts, not with polished comebacks, with the exact tone a frat house senior uses when the freshman won't shut up. Casual, tired, frankly annoyed, and every time the tab gets closed. If you like watching a comedian cut off a drunk audience member without breaking his rhythm, hit subscribe before this gets pulled. Before Gillis became the bouncer for every drunk in a 5-city radius, he was a working comedian defending his own specials. The room paid for the show. The room was mostly behaving, but not entirely. And this is what happens when the tab is open and the wrong person orders. First, the woman laughing too loud. This is his 2021 hour. Not even a heckle, just laughing wrong. Gillis stops the bit, addresses her directly, and closes her out in 6 words.
It's like, all right, settle down, dude.
The tab was open for exactly 15 seconds. The room settled. The bit continued. Gillis moved on like he'd cut off a friend at a birthday party, with the exact energy of a designated driver telling you it's time to go. Same special, new target, the crowd itself. Gillis asked if Trump was funny. The room cheered too hard like it was a rally. Gillis pumped the brakes on his own audience.
Well, hold on. I don't like the tone of that. That's not what I'm going for here.
Even when the crowd agrees with him, he'll cut them off. The bit is the bit. The audience doesn't get to hijack the room just because they're on his side. The bouncer works both directions. 2 years later, his Netflix hour. Gillis was mid-bit about historical armies, a bit that was already dark. A heckler yelled a single word to try to derail him. Gillis flipped it back into the room in 1 sentence, and the biggest laugh of the night came from a joke he wrote in real time off a drunk guy's outburst.
Gay Nazis? Just when you thought those guys couldn't look any sharper, they...
That's the mechanism. The heckler thinks he's ruining the bit. Gillis absorbs the interruption, spins it, and now the interruption is the bit. The tab is closed and the heckler is paying. Same special. Different heckler. Gillis was setting up a bit when someone in the crowd yelled agreement.
Yes! Preach, brother! Yeah.
He didn't shut the guy down. He mocked the sincerity, turned the enthusiasm into the punchline, and moved on. Sometimes the room hands you the assist. Gillis doesn't refuse an assist. But that's the stage. That's the specials. That's the rooms where the audience paid to be there and mostly behaves. The crazier heckler stories don't happen on his hour. They happen the night before it, in front of 200 drunk people who came to watch him drink. And every single one of those stories lives only in podcast form. First, the talker. A woman in the front row who spoke through his entire set. He'd tried polite. He'd tried ignoring. Neither worked. So Gillis switched targets.
Hi, they built a school. They're like, all right,
They go, all right, well, we got to fund Akron.
He didn't address her directly. He asked the boyfriend to handle her, which is the frat house equivalent of asking security to escort a customer out. He's not asking the room. He's asking the man who drove her there. Close her tab. She heard it. She left. But not without the exit speech every drunk gives on the way out. The accusations that whoever cut them off is racist and against women, delivered at full volume across the club.
Settle down, dude.
That's Gillis addressing the rest of the room. The tab is closed. The drunk is on her way to the parking lot. The show can move on. And it did. Different night, different city. A guy came up after the show to insult his outfit. Gillis was wearing a Patagonia shell, and Gillis took one look at what the guy was wearing. 3 sentences. An itemized inventory of the man's own fashion crimes. This is what happens when you try to run crowd work on the crowd worker after last call. The tab was closed before it even opened. Same guy. Same night. He followed up with the exact question the internet had answered years earlier. And Gillis's response wasn't a comeback. It was genuine confusion.
And I was just like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you doing that?
The tab was already closed. The guy was still trying to order. Gillis was too tired to explain it, which is somehow more devastating than any comeback would have been. North Carolina. A drunk fan yelled podcast references through Gillis's entire set. Security escorted him out. The guy snuck back in, and Gillis clocked him from the stage. The bouncer had already 86'd him. He still couldn't stay gone. Some drunks don't take the L. They come back for another lap. This one made it about 10 minutes into round 2 before he got pulled again. And sometimes the heckler wins. A guy lifted Gillis's hat off, told him the show sucked, insulted the hat, and flipped him off on his way out.
And then he walked by to leave, and I was like, real cool, dude. And he goes,
3 syllables and a stare. The tab was open. The guy got the last word. And then Gillis went home and told the story on a podcast, which is how the guy became the punchline 6 weeks later. The tab closed in the edit. And then there are the nights when Gillis isn't the bouncer. He's the customer. He's the drunk one. The tab is still his, but now he's the one at the bar. This is when the crowd work gets truly unhinged. Podcast livestream. Gillis visibly hammered. A drunk couple in the front row was making themselves the show. Gillis warned them about the room.
Listen, you know me. Don't listen to these guys.
That's the bouncer becoming the boss. He didn't kick them out, he threatened to. Both couples were still there 10 minutes later, mostly because Gillis was too drunk to actually follow through. But the warning landed. Everyone in the room heard the tab go on notice. Same night, same drunk guy. Gillis pivoted from the warning to a full-tilt roast. One line, one deep-cut reference. Exactly the right kind of specific. Nancy Kerrigan, 1994, the figure skating attack. A reference so specific to the era that most of the room had to Google it. Even shit-faced, Gillis's timing was better than the sober guys. The customer got the pull anyway. Different live stream. Another drunk left the room mid-episode. Gillis watched him stumble out and delivered a 5-word autopsy. Nobody outside of his podcast has ever used that phrase. That's the vocabulary of a man who has personally cataloged every stage of a blackout. He knows the levels because he's been to every single one of them. Kill Tony, drunk Gillis in the guest chair. A bucket pull comedian took the stage in cargo shorts. Gillis opened by insulting the pants before the guy could tell a joke.
I saw you walk on stage wearing those, and I was like, there's no way this guy's funny.
That's not true.
The tab was closed before the guy ordered. Gillis had judged the entire set from the sight of the shorts. And the frustrating part for the comedian is that Gillis was probably right. Same comedian, same set. Gillis pivoted from the shorts to the body.
He looks like Aquaman found unidentified on the beach.
A superhero comparison and a 2-word closer. This is the beer-loosened version of a bouncer who cannot help but stack the L's. Every insult is another pour on top of the last one. Nobody knew he'd been drinking except everyone. That's the small rooms, the podcasts, the niche podheads, and the industry crowd. The escalations happen when the room is bigger, when the crowd is national, when the whole audience is against him, and he still refuses to close his own tab. The 2025 ESPYS, a room full of professional athletes and their agents. Gillis tricked the audience into clapping for a fictional WNBA player, then called out the entire crowd for not knowing their own league.
I'm joking around. That's my friend's wife. I knew none of you knew WNBA players. That's crazy. You clap for that.
This was minute 2 of the monologue. It was also the moment the room decided it was going to be a long night. The tab was open on 40 million people. Later in the same monologue, he told an alien joke that name-checked Juan Soto. Someone in the crowd booed. Instead of skipping past it, Gillis stopped, located the sound, and closed that person's tab in front of every professional athlete in America.
It's an alien joke. Wait, who booed up there, dude? Shut up.
On live television, wearing the tuxedo. The bouncer was in a bow tie, and he was still enforcing the same rule he uses at a 200-seat club. You don't get to talk in his kitchen just because the room is nicer. By the closing joke, the audience had turned. The groan was loud enough to catch on the broadcast. Instead of apologizing, instead of pivoting to warmth, Gillis shrugged and told the room the truth. He doesn't need them. The tab was never going to be a good one. He said what he said, got paid, and left. That's the entire play. He's not here to make friends. He's here to close the show. But the biggest room and the tightest audience wasn't the ESPYS. It was Studio 8H SNL, the 2024 monologue. The room clapped in the wrong spot. A common late-night crowd reflex to signal support for a line the audience is nervous about. Gillis stopped the applause mid-clap. At 30 Rock, on the biggest stage in American comedy. He treated the audience like an open mic that needed correcting. Same monologue, a joke that ran a little too long for the room. The audience tightened up. Gillis addressed it, not by softening, not by apologizing. That's a monologuer telling the SNL crowd they're the problem, which is the closest a host gets to flipping over the desk. He was live, he was hosting, and he was still refusing to close the tab on his own material. But if you want the definitive story, the one Gillis has told on 3 different podcasts because it still cracks him up, you have to go to Phoenix, after the show, outside the bar, in front of the guy's wife. Phoenix, show over. Gillis walking to his car in the parking lot. A guy was waiting for him, with his wife standing right next to him, for the specific purpose of informing Gillis that it was the worst show he had ever seen. Gillis didn't diffuse, he didn't pivot. He said 2 words, in front of the man's wife, and walked away. The wife heard it, the husband heard it. Gillis heard himself say it, got in the car, and drove home. And 2 weeks later, he told the story on a podcast because it still made him laugh. That's the tab. That's the close. That's the bouncer at last call. Even in the parking lot. Even when the room is empty. Even when the drunk isn't drunk anymore. The doors are locked. The lights are up. Nobody's ordering another round. If you want to see the same playbook run on Hollywood itself, Cat Williams has spent 2 decades exposing the industry's biggest names, the dirtiest secrets, and the frauds nobody else will call out. The full breakdown is in the description. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Bars closed.